Hello, everybody. This is Kenton Taylor Howard from the University of Central Florida, and this is the advanced ink demo. And today I'll be reviewing some of the comments in my commented ink file that say advanced and kind of introduce some of the advanced functionality of the Inky editor and ink coding language. If you haven't watched the basic video, I would go back and watch that one first. This video kind of assumes that you have watched that basic video and that you've read through the basic ink tutorial on their website up to the advanced section. So if you haven't done those two things yet, I would go back and do those first. I would say most of the content in this video is not going to make a lot of sense unless you've done so. I'm going to do a real quick review here to start out of some of the things I did cover in the last video, but it will be very, very brief. So I would highly recommend that if you haven't checked out that video and read through that web tutorial yet, that you go back and do that first. So really quickly, what I covered in the last video, first of all, was that I have comments throughout this commented ink file, which you should be able to find on web courses. If you haven't downloaded that, I would also go ahead and download that at this point. But some of the comments were labeled advanced. So you'll see these / symbols. These are the places where I put comments. And in this demo, I'm going to be focusing specifically on the ones that are marked advanced. So I'll be kind of taking you through those. Just as a real quick review of what I mentioned in the last video, this is what a divert looks like. It looks kind of almost like an arrow symbol. And diverts allow you to kind of jump to a different chunk of the story. To jump to a chunk of the story, you have to label that chunk of the story first. So you have to kind of give it a name. You do that by using knots, which I've got highlighted here. It's an equal sign, and then you basically put in the name of whatever you want to name that chunk of the story. You can then use a divert using that little arrow symbol to jump to a knot. The other thing that I showed in the previous video was what a choice looks like. And there are a couple variations of how you can build choices. So I'm not going to necessarily go through all of those here since they're covered in the last video. But just as a brief review, it's usually going to be either a plus or asterisk symbol and some text, and that essentially becomes something that the user can click on within your story. So here I've got the get more information about ink choice highlighted, and on the right side of the screen you can see if I click that, it displays the text within that choice and executes the code within that choice. So you can put essentially whatever you want to a choice. You can put text, you can put diverts, you can put code, and whenever the user clicks on it, it will automatically activate. So that essentially is a very, very quick review of what I covered in the last video, just to kind of make sure that you are remembering the concepts that I went over. But now I'm going to jump quite a bit ahead in the ink file. So if you're trying to follow along yourself while you're watching this video, I'm jumping to about line 55 or so. This is where the first advanced content shows up, and the advanced content I'm covering in this video lines up with the advanced section of the ink web tutorial. So this is the content that they're also introducing there if you're trying to read along in the guide. And the biggest thing they focus on in the advanced section of the web tutorial is one of the main advanced logic functions of ink that's referred to as alternatives. And essentially what alternatives do is allow you to vary up the content that you're showing to your user based on different things that you've decided that you want to use to control that. And that sounds a little complicated because there are a number of different alternatives that you can use. And what I'm mostly going to be doing in this video is going through those different alternatives, showing you examples of them and kind of explaining, okay, what do they do and how could you potentially use them in your story? So what you're seeing here on line 55 and the comment on line 56 is explaining it is the first type of alternative that I'm going to introduce in this video. Typically, alternatives are going to be marked with kind of curly bracket symbols. So you'll see consistently in almost every type of alternative this curly bracket, and that kind of introduces the alternative. You end the alternative by putting in another curly bracket at the end to kind of close it, basically. After the curly bracket in an alternative, you usually put in another symbol to kind of tell the alternative, okay, this is what type of alternative you are, more or less. And there's a number of different variations on alternatives that you can use. But if you don't put any code in at all, if you just kind of put the curly bracket and you start typing in your text, what you'll create is called a sequence. Sequences basically show the user content based on how many times they've returned to that section. And you'll see what I've got here is kind of vertical slash marks to mark off sections of text. So the way you create a sequence is by entering a curly bracket, typing in some text, putting in a vertical slash, typing in another set of text, putting in a vertical slash, typing in a third set of text, etc. And what happens is each time the user returns to that section of the story, they're going to see the corresponding block of text. So if they return to it a second time, they'll see section number 2. If they return to it the third time, they'll see section number 3. If they return to it the fourth time, they'll see section number 4, and so on. With a sequence, once the user has reached kind of the last chunk of text within your sequence, it will keep displaying that last chunk. So if they, for example, you've got 3 different chunks of text within your sequence and the user returns 5 times, on the 4th and 5th time, they will see the last or third chunk of text that you entered into that sequence. I think Inky refers to that as a stopping block. Essentially, they say like the last thing in your sequence is going to continue repeating, basically. So what sequences are mostly used for is looping content. They're used for sections of your story where the user is going to return more than once to the same knot, but you want them to see something slightly different every time they return to that knot. So you don't want them to just see the same text over and over again. And I'm using this in the stalking section of my story so that you can stalk this old man in the story for up to 8 nights, and each time you stalk him, it displays a slightly different set of text, like it's the 5th night, it's the 6th night, etc. So. Keep in mind that I've got a divert here at the end of my alternative. So you'll notice that at the very, very end, it actually jumps to another section of the story called 8 Nights. So it's very possible to put diverts inside of alternatives. You can put choices inside of alternatives. You can essentially nest almost anything you want to inside of an alternative. So keep in mind when you're using these that you can combine them with some of the other coding functionality you know to create some fairly complicated sections of content if that's something that you're interested in doing. So I'm going to jump down to the next example of an alternative that I use in my story. I'm going to show you 3 of the 5 that I've used in my story, and then I'll kind of explain what the other 2 are just simply because they didn't fit with my story and it didn't make sense to kind of include them. But I'm going to jump down to the next type. And you'll notice me skipping past a comment here in a moment that it's not relevant. I'll kind of catch up to later. But here I want to draw you to the second type of alternative called a shuffle. So you can see here, and this is on line 85 if you're trying to follow along in the commented ink file, there's a curly bracket to start an alternative. And then I have a tilde symbol. It's kind of like the wiggly line symbol. That is what creating what's called a shuffle. And when you create a shuffle, what you're basically doing is creating an alternative that kind of flips the coin or randomly chooses among all the options that you put inside of the alternative. So what I've got here are 2 options inside of my alternative. You'll see kind of like a slash symbol about halfway through after this first divert. What happens is essentially if the user chooses this option, it flips a coin and chooses from one of these two options inside of the alternative. So it either lets the user successfully escape or lets the user fail to escape. That's essentially the way that I've got it set up. You can put more than 2 in here, so you can put as many as you want, and it's going to randomly choose from one of the options that you've got in there. So if you've got 10 inside of your shuffle, it's going to have a basically 1 in 10 chance of picking any of those options that you kind of selected there. So shuffles are basically made to create randomized content. That's basically the best way to think about it. And it gives an equal chance to each element of that randomized shuffle. So keep in mind, you can't make, like one of the options 3 times as likely as the other unless you just manually code that in by putting in 3 times as many chunks of text that correspond to that as the other thing that you want the user to see. That would be a way of making that work. So. But it essentially lets you do randomization. So if you're trying to do randomization within Inky, you can accomplish basic randomization by using a shuffle. And it's just an alternative that has a tilde symbol in it. That's the easiest way to think about it. I'm going to skip past the explanation of stitches here real quickly and save that for the end, because that's something you may or may not necessarily decide you need to use a lot of, whereas these alternatives, I think, will be something that shows up a little bit more often in most types of ink stories. But I want to show you the last type of alternative here called a conditional, especially because this is a particular type of alternative that I think is going to get used a lot in different types of stories. It's one of the most useful ones. A conditional is an alternative where you essentially check whether or not the user has seen a piece of content and then show them text based on that. So I'll show you an example up here. Again, it uses a curly bracket. Right after that curly bracket, you'll see that I've got the phrase knife typed in with a colon and then some text afterwards. What that is doing is checking whether or not my user has seen the knot called knife. One of the things that Ink introduces a little on in some of its demos and doesn't immediately kind of emphasize the importance or usefulness of is the fact that every knot in Ink is basically a variable. Ink keeps track of whether or not the user has seen it and even how many times they've seen it, and you can use that within conditionals and alternatives and things like that to do all sorts of interesting stuff. So a conditional essentially tests whether or not the user has seen a particular knot. If they have, it shows them the corresponding content, and if they haven't, it shows them the alternative content. So you'll see here that this one shows them that I then pulled my blade turning toward the other, and then swap jumps to the knife attack section of the story if they have actually seen the knife knot. So if they've actually seen the knife earlier, they can then kind of attack with that knife. But if they haven't seen the knife, they don't have the knife, it would make no sense for them to give the user that option. So I've got the alternative option here after the vertical slash. And in that alternative, since the user doesn't have the knife, they just kind of get attacked and knocked unconscious. So their attack fails. So you can use this very, very effectively to check whether or not the user has seen certain pieces of your story. And it's a really, really common function within Ink. It's something that's almost like a baseline functionality of it. It's something that I think gets used a lot in these kinds of stories. So this is going to be one of the ones that you probably use the most of. And essentially what you're doing is, again, creating an alternative with a curly bracket, type in the name of a particular knot, type in the text you want them to see if they've seen that knot, and make sure you do a vertical slash with a backup option in case they haven't seen the knot. So that kind of explains the three main functions of alternatives that are within this Ink file. There are two others that just didn't really work well with my story, so I didn't put examples of them into this Ink file here. But I will quickly explain what they are, just in case there's something that could be useful for you. And if you look in the Ink demo on their website in the advanced section where they're talking about how alternatives work, they introduce both of these functionalities. So they're definitely things that you can see within the demo if you want to see visual examples of it. But just to briefly explain what they do, there's a type of alternative called a cycle. And you mark one of these with an ampersand or like the and sign. So you put in a curly bracket, you put in the and sign. And essentially what a cycle is a looping sequence. So I mentioned earlier, when you create a sequence, I'll jump back up to the sequence in my file real quick to illustrate what it looks like. Earlier, when I was introducing these, I pointed out what happens if the user returns to this section 9 times and you've only got 8 options is they will keep seeing the last option in that sequence. The Ink refers to it as a stopping block, and basically what they say is the sequence stops at this point. So the user returns to it 5 times, but there were 3 things in your sequence, they're going to keep seeing that last item. A cycle loops. So basically, if the user in the example I was just giving you returned on time number 4, there are 3 options inside of your cycle, and they come back a 4th time, they're going to see option 1 again. When they come back a 5th time, they'll see option 2. When they come back a 6th time, they'll see option 3, and so on. So you can think of cycles like looping sequences. They're marked with an ampersand or an and sign, so it's pretty easy to set one up. If I wanted to make this into one, for example, all I would literally do is type an ampersand right there, and suddenly that would be a cycle instead, and that content would loop. So the other type of alternative, and it's kind of another variation on the sequence, so I think that it kind of makes sense to explain it while showing you what a sequence looks like, is called a once only. And you mark it with an exclamation point. So if I wanted to turn this into a once only, I would just put an exclamation point in front of this sequence that I've entered. And the way to think of it is it's like a sequence with a blank last entry. So if the user returns to this section more times than the number of items you put into your sequence, they will just see a blank content, like they won't see anything else. So if I've got 3 options in my sequence or in my once only, and the user returns to that section a 4th time, what they're going to see is nothing. Basically, it will just have nothing to show them. So these are occasionally useful. I think they're probably the least often used of all the types of alternatives. But if for some reason you want to ensure that the user doesn't see anything when they return to a section after a certain number of times, you can use a once only to do that. So I'm going to show you one other feature of alternatives here, and then show you one other minor piece of functionality in Ink that may be useful when you're using a lot of these. I'm going to jump down to the ending of my story, which you'll see starting up around line 109. This is where it's a knot called final ending. And what I've essentially done at the very end of my story is created a section where it reviews the user's choices. So it actually kind of checks almost all of the previous knots that the user has been through at different points of the story and kind of gives them a review and shows them some text based on whatever they decided on. What I'm kind of using this to show you is how you can quickly use alternatives and various types of alternatives nested within each other to create some pretty complicated content. And the final ending section here might look very, very complex, but in reality, it's really not as complicated as you might think it is. So what essentially I've got in this section right here, starting on line 110, is the first choice in the story. And the first choice in my Ink story, you decide what the relationship between the narrator and the person he's killed is. And essentially, I've got a conditional set up that displays text based on whatever the user chose for that choice. So if they decided that it was a employment relationship, then it says, was the old man employee? They decided the old man was the narrator's father, it says, was the old man's child? So essentially, it's just a set of conditionals, all right after one right after each other, that check which of those knots that the user saw and displays the relevant text. I did the same thing for the motive choice. I did the same thing for the murder weapon choice. Down here, you'll see what I'm actually doing with the escape choice is checking whether or not the user successfully escaped, or if they went with the knife option, I'm checking whether or not they successfully attacked or failed to attack the police. And you'll notice that the way these are set up is that they say escape failed or escape success, attack knife attack failed, etc. I'll explain that more in just a moment when I show you what a stitch is, but essentially I'm checking something within that knot. So I'm actually looking inside of the attack knot to see whether or not they saw attack failed or knife attack, and I'll explain in a second how you set that up. But again, it looks relatively complicated. For example, here on line 114, you'll see I've got a bunch of nested conditionals all within the same selection. You see like a bunch of curly brackets at the end here. What it's doing is checking a bunch of different combinations of choices and seeing did the user do all of these things. And if the user did all of those things, it displays the special ending, which what this special ending is the user following the story exactly the same way as Edgar Allan Poe's original short story that this is based on. So if you do that, the story can check whether or not you have and display the relevant ending. So what I'm trying to show you here is the way that you can use lots of alternatives and lots of types of alternatives within each other, kind of like in conjunction with each other, to create some relatively advanced content to display to your user. So it's definitely something that it's one of the powerful functions of Ink. It's one of the things that Ink is really good at and can do a lot of interesting stuff with. So it's definitely something to keep in mind for your story. The only other thing I do want to show you is one more piece of functionality with Ink that I didn't want to introduce earlier because I was trying to kind of focus exclusively on alternatives. But now I want to show you the concept of the stitch. And the best way to describe a stitch, they're marked with a single equal sign. So you'll see here, I've got equal sign, escape success, equal sign, escape failed. And if you think back to knots, you'll remember that knots are marked with a double equal sign. So if I wanted to make a knot, I would put, like, for example, right here, equal sign, police, something like that. So stitches are basically marked with a single equal sign instead of a double equal sign. And they work exactly the same way as a knot. So if you're wondering what's the difference between a stitch and a knot, there's essentially no difference other than stitches go within knots. So you can almost think of them as knots within knots. What you can use them for is story organization. And so like if you've got a knot that you want to have multiple different locations or chunks or kind of sections of content within that actual knot, you can use stitches. And then stitches are almost like subknots, or maybe that's a way of thinking about it. And they let you kind of mark off little chunks of content within that knot. So like, for example, here I've got the escape knot, but there's two variations to escape. There's either the successful escape or the failed escape. And instead of building two different knots for escape success and escape failed, which I could have done if I really wanted to, I instead decided since they're part of the escape section of the story, let's put them within escape. And so I use stitches to put them inside of the escape section instead. And the dots down here at my very ending section, where you're seeing all of these different alternatives, and you occasionally saw some stuff like escape success or escape failed. All that's doing is checking the stitch. So what this piece of content does is checks whether or not the user went to escape and whether or not they saw the escape success stitch. Here it checks whether or not they went to the escape not, and then whether or not they went to the escape failed stitch, and displays the relevant content. So stitches are just kind of useful for story organization, and they kind of help you condense your story down. So overall, again, just to review, what I showed you here were different types of alternatives. I'm not going to necessarily jump back through the file and show you all the types of alternatives again, because that would be kind of too long to kind of review through. But the basic type is called a sequence. That just lets you kind of create content that varies up based on looping. So whether or not the user has returned to it X number of times, they'll see the relevant chunk in the sequence. I showed you shuffles, which is basically using a tilde symbol to create an alternative that's randomized. So if you've got two options in that alternative, it flips a coin and shows the user one of those two. I showed you conditionals, which are alternatives where you set a particular not or even a not and a stitch that you want to make sure the user has seen, and then show them text based on whether or not they've seen that. I didn't show you cycles and once onlys, but I did mention them. So, and you can look at examples of those in the Inky demo on their website if you want to. Cycles are looping sequences, and once onlys are like sequences with an empty last element. And then I showed you stitches, which are kind of like sub-knots. They're like a smaller version of a knot within a knot. So that kind of brings me to the end of my advanced ink demo. I will say there is a massive amount of functionality in ink that I'm not talking about, just simply because you can go even much more in depth with ink if you're really interested to. For example, ink has the ability to set variables without using a not, and like checking whether or not a user has seen it, you can just set up a variable. Ink has math functionality, so you can do mathematical equations and check numbers and things like that. Ink has the ability to do if-then statements, so you can set up a if the user has seen this, or if they haven't, do this. So there's lots of other really interesting functionality that's in Ink as well that I'm not going to dig into here, just simply because it's not necessarily something that you need to do to create a basic kind of interactive fiction. But I hope that this was useful to you, and make sure that you've also looked through the Advanced Ink demo on the website itself, since they also cover some really, really useful content, and you can see a lot more examples than some of the examples that are just on my story. And I hope you have a good day.